So if you imagine a huge farm field, it's typically only about 10% of that field that would go into native prairie. And these strips are not large, so they can vary anything from as little as 2 acres on a given farm, and sometimes much more, but they can be quite small. And then the strips themselves are relatively narrow, and so the size is typically like 30 to 120 feet wide. We're not talking about giant patches of prairie. We're talking about essentially postage stamps on the landscape. And yet, they do seem to attract pollinators. And so the pollinators that are out there that are still trying to eke out an existence in these landscapes are attracted to these prairie strips. And so that was a nice bonus and something that we were really excited about, because it is really hard to find places for pollinator habitat in Iowa. So, of course, there are a few larger scale remnant prairies and things like that, but very, very, very few. So as I said, less than 0.1% of Iowa's landscape is in these prairies. And so any little bit is kind of a win in terms of gain of habitat that could potentially support these pollinators.
From the Oregon State University Extension Service, this is Pollination, a podcast that tells the stories of researchers, land managers, and people like you who are making bold strides to improve the health of pollinators. I'm your host, Dr. Adoni Melathopoulos, Associate Professor of Pollinator Health in the Department of Horticulture. There has been intense interest in using uncultivated strips of vegetation on field edges as a way to reduce effluent from agriculture coming into waterways. If you recall, back in episode 246, we talked with Tim Youngquist from Iowa State University Extension about how to manage these strips in a way that reduces weed establishment and maximizes perennial flowers for pollinating insects. I have to say I've subsequently used that example in training I give here in Oregon to pesticide applicators on how you can manage weeds, but still at the same time increase flowering plant diversity on the landscape. So it is no lie that this podcast episode has set off a real interest of mine in the benefits of these strips to pollinating insects. I was so excited to discover the work of our next guest for this reason. Dr. Amy Toth also hails from the epicenter of filter strips, Iowa State University, where she's a professor in the Department of Plant Pathology, Entomology, and Microbiology. She runs the Integrative Insect Sociobiology program and is the chair of the graduate program in Ecology and Evolutionary Biology at Iowa State. Today, she's going to tell us about work her team and their collaborators have done to evaluate the extent of the benefits of these strips to honeybees, wild bees, and monarch butterflies. So let's cruise along the strip this week on Pollination. Well, welcome to Pollination, Dr. Toth.
Thank you. It's great to be here.
Maybe to begin, to orient our listeners, can you describe the landscape in Iowa? I mean, it's very different than here in Oregon. And how do projects like what we're going to be talking about today, filter strips, fit into the picture?
Yeah, thanks for the question. That's great. I realize not everyone has spent a lot of time in Iowa. It's often thought of as flyover country. So it is, I think, beautiful in its own sort of Midwestern subtle way. But Iowa is really the quintessential Midwestern farm landscape. So if you were to drive through, it's an incredible place to farm, and the amount of crops that are produced here is quite remarkable. So we have literally seas of corn and soybeans here. Those are the main crops that you'll see. And this is related to Iowa's history. So it's has a history of being tall grass prairie, and it's relatively flat, sort of gently undulating landscape. There's also incredible soil quality here, and that's from Iowa's history of being a tall grass prairie. So we have amazing soils, and that's thanks to millennia of bison grazing and fertilization through that process. And so Iowa today looks very different than it did historically. So these prairies were historically covered by this diverse mix of grasses and forbs. And about 80% of Iowa was historically covered by these tallgrass prairies. And there are also several rivers. So we have the Mississippi on the east, but there are multiple other rivers that run through Iowa. And so sort of this mix of tallgrass prairie and forested areas along the rivers. Today, it looks really different. And so with colonization and more recently industrial scale agriculture, the landscape has changed dramatically. So now only 0.1% of those prairies remain.
Okay.
And over 85% of the landscape is in corn and soybean agriculture. And so when I say seas of corn and soybean, I imagine just as far as the eye can see,
Okay.
just these perfect rows of corn and soybeans. So it's really quite a dramatic landscape in that way, that it's sometimes referred to as the most human disturbed state in the Union because of this massive coverage of these two crops. And so we went from historically this very diverse ecosystem. I've heard it referred to as, the Midwestern rainforest. It's got this amazing diversity with, imagine, birds and reptiles and mammals and all kinds of pollinators, of course, flying around in these landscapes. And today it looks very, very different. Of course, there's a lot of intensive agriculture, which involves often tillage, as well as weed control. And so when the crops are not in place, instead of a green sort of sea, you see just this brown, barren landscape for much of the year when the crops are not actually in the ground. And so that leads to a very dramatic landscape, which, as you can imagine, is not really hospitable to pollinators.
We had a previous episode from someone from Iowa State talking about filter strips, and that these, inadvertently by, agriculture, really not having any edges, this can lead to issues associated with water quality. That all these river systems and the agricultural areas effluent can come into the water.
Absolutely. So that was really the primary driver for the development of the prairie strips practice. And if you imagine this amazing topsoil, but for much of the year there's nothing planted in it. And then with heavy rains, a lot of this can erode off. And as that erodes off, well, first of all, farmers are losing their topsoil at an alarming rate. And so farmers themselves are worried about their grandchildren and future generations not having topsoil to farm. But at the same time, as that soil washes into waterways, it is causing major issues with water quality. So nitrogen, phosphorus, we get these influxes of nutrients into the water system, which can lead to harmful algal blooms and just affect wildlife and water quality in bad ways. Of course, a lot of these rivers are connected to the Mississippi, and so this actually flows all the way down to the Gulf of Mexico. And so these are having large effects. Even though, it starts maybe far away, these things can all literally trickle together and have these broad effects. And of course, Iowa is an example, but similar types of agricultural practices are happening throughout the upper Midwest.
I was really impressed when I was on that podcast, just the extent to which Iowa has adopted this filter strip program. It seems like a real success story, and farmers have seen the benefits. I imagine water quality in a rural community is a real, important issue. But I guess the issue, what I'm interested in is, these strips are not primarily developed for pollinators. I can imagine, having this double duty, if you had some flowering forbs that might have been in those those original grassland communities come back into these filter strips, that they may also be contaminated. Walk us through this kind of problem.
Yeah. So maybe what I'll do is first describe a little bit exactly what is a prairie strip, because
great.
Driving through the landscape, you may see different types of buffer strips in place. And so buffer strips have been in practice for quite some time to reduce soil erosion. And so those typically, however, were planted with just a few species and usually exotic grasses. And so when you're introducing something like that, that can help with some of the erosion issues, but they're non-native plants and they're not going to really provide a lot of habitat for for different species, and they're not going to be providing resources for pollinators. And so enter prairie strips. And so prairie strips have the added benefit of, so they have the very deep roots of these prairie plants, which are important in erosion control and water quality. And this is actually the primary reason why most farmers would want to adopt something like prairie strips. But at the same time, they're seeded with a diverse mix of grasses and forbs, and those forbs attract pollinators. And so the original intent wasn't necessarily to attract pollinators, but lo and behold, if you build it, they will come. And it turns out that a lot of pollinators are utilizing these prairie strips. And so research has shown increased abundance and diversity of wild bees, and also increased visitation by monarch butterflies, which are a species of conservation concern. So they've turned into these little islands of pollinator habitat, and they really are relatively small. And I think that's maybe one of the reasons that it wasn't originally sort of marketed as pollinator habitat. So if you imagine a huge farm field, it's typically only about 10% of that field that would go into native prairie. And these strips are not large, so they can vary anything from as little as 2 acres on a given farm, and sometimes much more, but they can be quite small. And then the strips themselves are relatively narrow, and so the size is typically like 30 to 120 feet wide. We're not talking about giant patches of prairie. We're talking about essentially postage stamps on the landscape. And yet, they do seem to attract pollinators. And so the pollinators that are out there that are still trying to eke out an existence in these landscapes are attracted to these prairie strips. And so that was a nice bonus and something that we were really excited about, because it is really hard to find places for pollinator habitat in Iowa. So, of course, there are a few larger scale remnant prairies and things like that, but very, very, very few. So as I said, less than 0.1% of Iowa's landscape is in these prairies. And so any little bit is kind of a win in terms of gain of habitat that could potentially support these pollinators.
I was excited when I heard you talk about this work at a recent seminar series that we were involved with, because you actually posed this as a question, a research question, an ongoing research in your lab. Tell us a little bit about how one goes about testing these, benefits. Tell us about your experimental design.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think, first of all, previous research by others at Iowa State had shown that there are more pollinators present at these prairie strips. So that's a good start, right? Just seeing that they're present. But what we wanted to do is ask whether there are more wide-reaching benefits to pollinators. So we set up a series of experiments, and I'm going to refer to some work that was done with a lot of collaborators, and I wasn't necessarily involved in all this work, but I'm speaking on behalf of the group. So there were a couple of studies. One was focused more on wild bees, another was focused on monarch butterflies, and then another set of studies has looked at managed honeybees. And so I'll start with the wild bees. So in addition to increased abundance and diversity of wild bees, a student, Kate Borchardt, actually looked at the interactions between the bees and the plants. And that's important because it's not just about are they there, but are they actually helpful in terms of pollination, the ecosystem services that they provide. So her work showed that there are actually more interconnections between the bee community and the plant community in pollinator strips, in prairie strips, compared to field margins. And so we chose as a control for a lot of these studies the field margins, which are typically grass and mostly like weedy species, a lot of which are exotic, a few sort of more weedy native species as well. But that's typically what's on the landscape for pollinators if something like a prairie strip is not present. In most farm areas, the pollinators are not going to have a large prairie remnant or restoration that they have access to, so their options are limited. And so, so finding that there were these stronger connections between plants and pollinators, that's important because if a species is removed from the community, which can happen, some of these species are relatively rare, what that means is there's going to be more support for those interactions if one or two species disappear, and so that can lead to more robust plant-pollinator interactions in sort of a community sense.
Okay, great.
That was one finding with the wild bees. With the monarch butterflies, they're finding more milkweeds in these prairie strips, as well as more visitation by monarch butterflies. So that was good news as well. And then with the honeybees, this was an experiment that was run by Ge Zhang, so a former grad student. And this involved the actual placement of apiaries on prairie strips, and then the placement of apiaries on controls, which were these field margins. And what Ge found was that colonies in prairie strips showed larger growth, so they got bigger. And they also had larger populations of adult bees. And they also suffered lower mortality. And this is really nice to see because it turns out that we're in an area of the country which experiences incredibly high colony losses for honeybees. So there are years where the average colony loss can be over 50%, sometimes as high as 60 or 70% statewide. It's very bad. And so anything that can reduce colony mortality as well as increase colony weight, which is correlated with honey production, that would be an excellent boost for beekeepers. So one of the projects that we've been doing was following that up and actually working with beekeepers to see if they experience increased honey production when managing their colonies sort of in a typical way on prairie strips.
Is that work underway? Do we know the results of it?
Yeah, so we have 1 year of data in, and it's a 2-year project. And what we're seeing is definitely some positive effects on prairie strips. But it does depend on management, and so not all beekeepers experienced the same kind of positive effects. And so sometimes, for example, like if colonies had large problems with mite control or something like that, then we didn't always necessarily see the effects being as robust. So it's a combination probably of colony management and access to these prairie strips, which we think are providing especially access to diverse plants in the later season. So if you imagine this landscape, in summertime, things are actually fairly decent. Honeybees and other pollinators do like to forage on soybeans. Corn, not so great. It's wind pollinated. But soybeans, they produce a lot of nectar, but it's for a very short period of time. And then also these weedy species in the field margins, such as clover, can be really good, but again, it's for a limited time. However, if you look at a prairie, all the way into the late summer, August, September, and even into the fall, there are flowers blooming. So this late season seems to be a critical period where there's very little available in the landscape in terms of forage for pollinators. And this really seems to be the place where we see this bump from the prairie strips.
We see something very similar in the West where, we hit the drought season and really you're into the period of time when the composites and the asters that were traditionally in these landscapes dominated, and with that group really not having sunflower is the agricultural analog, but without that you really are left with a period where a natural landscape would be providing nectar and pollen resources that simply isn't in an agricultural system.
Exactly. Yeah, for sure. And it's interesting too, because here in Iowa, and I know in other places too, beekeepers have just gotten used to feeding their colonies a lot at that time of year. And of course, it's often post-honey harvest, so that makes sense. And that can be a good management strategy, but what if you didn't have to feed your colonies? Because prairies were doing that for you. Wouldn't that be nice, right? And so, and we also see that they're foraging on a much more diverse set of species too, which we know can give them benefits in terms of their physiology and immune health to have more diverse forage. And so, yeah, you could give them corn syrup, but they might be better off foraging on these diverse wildflowers in the later season. And we know going into winter, it's really important for honeybees to be healthy so that they can overwinter in a good state.
All right, so we've got more robust wild bee networks, so that there's a lot more robust plant communities supporting wild bees. Presumably over time that would allow them to do better. We're seeing more milkweed stems in the landscape, which is important for monarch butterfly conservation. And beekeepers there is a benefit to them as well, especially in this period after soybean comes out of bloom. They can keep their colonies going. I suppose there's a lot of upside to this. Where do you see these research findings going? Is this, especially as you point out, like maybe the primary concern from both regulators and from farmers is water quality. What's the prospects of making a switch over to a kind of prairie strip system from these maybe older systems that are really kind of focused on erosion control and water quality?
Yeah. So I think it is quite promising. And so one of the major events that has assisted the adoption of prairie strips is its incorporation into the Conservation Reserve Program. And so in 2018, prairie strips was included as a practice in the U.S. Farm Bill. So CP 43 is the practice. And since then, adoption has increased greatly. And so at this point in time, there are now prairie strips in 15 states and covering over 22,000 acres. And so this is something that people are signing up for. And, this practice is really catching on, which is exciting. So I think that's really good news. And I think that a lot of what's been interesting about that is, yes, the primary motivation has been soil quality, erosion control, water quality issues. But actually, when you talk to Iowa residents, in fact, the number 2 reason they report for being interested in prairie strips is pollinators. Oh. And this is quite fascinating because the crops that people are growing do not depend on pollination. And so corn is wind pollinated, and soybean, of course, it varies by time and place and variety. But here in Iowa, it's mostly self-pollinated varieties. And so they really don't need the bees and other pollinators to be there. And yet, interestingly, when we talk to people who've adopted prairie strips, they love to talk about the pollinators that have visited. They love to go out and observe, and it seems to stimulate a sort of biophilia, to use E.O. Wilson's term, and just going out and seeing nature return to their land. And it's like, I had no idea there were this many different species of bees on my property, and here they are. So I think that real tangible connection to nature and connection to biodiversity is something that has been an added benefit. And I think it was, for some folks, it may have been one of the original motivators, but for others, it may have actually somewhat surprised them and has been an added bonus to adopting the practice. So that's been really exciting to sort of see that people are doing this for real practical agronomic financial reasons, but then also sort of realizing the environmental benefits and really feeling positive about that as well.
This is wonderful. Thank you so much for taking time to describe this work to us. I know in the previous episode I did with Iowa State, it became clear that Oregon lags behind the adoption of, you said it was CP 43, the practice that the Natural Resource Conservation Service will help fund. So hopefully this inspires a number of Oregonians or growers here in the Pacific Northwest to consider these options. Thank you so much for taking time with us today.
You're welcome. Yeah.
Thank you so much for listening. Show notes with links from each episode are available at the website pollinationpodcast.oregonstate.edu. I also love hearing from you, and there's a form at the website where you can pop in and say hello and give me feedback. If you want to support the show, remember to leave a rating on iTunes, Spotify, or whatever podcast mothership you use. And finally, if you have the means and you want to help support my lab's effort to document bee biodiversity in Oregon, visit OregonBeeAtlas.org and follow down to the donate button where you can make a tax-deductible donation to the Jerry and Judith Paul Native Pollinator Endowment. Every little bit helps. See you next episode.